Good evening, church. Let me first thank Sister Dr. Kay Thompson for that very gracious introduction. And I must begin by thanking Bishop Derek Richards for my being here tonight to deliver this lecture. This was something that the bishop concocted approximately 1 year ago, and it has come to fruition. I also want to dedicate this lecture to my parents, Reverend Vivian Comissiong, and his wife, Mrs. Jean Comissiong. They would be very happy now. They're probably smiling to see their son in a Methodist church lecturing about John Wesley. I know they're very happy at this precise moment. So the topic is John Wesley's thoughts upon slavery, a prism through which to assess the Methodist Church's anti-slavery record and to reflect on the claim for reparations. And what I really want to do in this lecture is to really focus on that John Wesley publication, that 30-page book that he published in 1774. So everything is going to build towards that, and we're going to look at that book in some depth. And also, I have to focus on the imperishable example of the Right Excellent Sarah Ann Gill. So we have a lot of ground to cover tonight. Let's get into it. Now, this lecture is extremely timely. Why is this lecture so timely? Well, on the 25th of March, the government of Ghana went before the United Nations General Assembly with a resolution. The resolution was entitled Declaration of the Trafficking of Enslaved Africans and the Racialized Chattel Enslavement of Africans as the gravest crime against humanity. That resolution, and I'm proud to say that Barbados was a sponsor of that resolution. That resolution was debated in the UN General Assembly, and it was passed. 123 nations voted in favor of that resolution. 3 nations voted against that resolution, and 52 nations abstained. It is my duty to tell you that the 123 nations that voted in favor consisted of virtually all of the nations of the continent of Africa, virtually all of the nations of the Caribbean, almost all of the nations of Latin America and Asia. There was one exception from Latin America, that was Argentina. 123, basically the black and brown nations of the world. The 3 nations that voted against were the usual culprits: the United States of America, Israel, and Argentina. I guess we expect that. But what was really worrying was the 52 nations that abstained. The United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, virtually all of the, not virtually, all of the European Union countries. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, the entire white world either rejected this notion of the enslavement of African people being the gravest crime against humanity, either rejected it or were not prepared to accept it. So that tells you, in terms of our reparations struggle, that we have a very big job ahead of us. We cannot win the reparations struggle unless we win a significant component of the hearts and minds and consciences of the people who inhabit the countries that owe us reparations. I mean, that's the reality. That's the reality. So we have, part of our reparations struggle is, yes, we have diplomatic tactics, we have legal strategies, but a big part of the campaign has to be to focus on winning the hearts and souls and consciences. You're not going to get everybody. You're not going to get the elite, the establishment people, but you have to be able to get the church people, the youth, the women, people of good conscience. And I will be arguing in this lecture that this forgotten book of John Wesley and the example of John Wesley way back in the 18th century can be a critical instrument in our battle to win the hearts and minds of the people, particularly of the United Kingdom, but of Western Europe in general. So that is why it is important that we focus upon, that is why we must unearth this effort that John Wesley made. We must unearth this document, this 30-page document that he produced back in 1774, not just for historical reasons, but to deploy it as a weapon, as an instrument in the ongoing struggle, the ongoing campaign for reparations. So let us sketch the scenario that led up to John Wesley writing and publishing thoughts upon slavery. And of course, we have to begin at the beginning, the transatlantic slave trade. I don't want to assume that everybody has all of the historical knowledge. A few years ago, I wrote an article entitled Exploding the Myth of African Responsibility for Slavery. And I dealt with, how did this slave trade begin? Well, I dealt with the Portuguese, but I also dealt with the British. And this is what I said in that article. The British trade started with the two voyages of Captain John Hawkins in 1562 and 1564. This is how these voyages were described in several publications, including the 1878 Hakluyt Society publication entitled The Hawkins Voyages. This is what they recorded. Hawkins sailed with 3 ships from England in 1562. In the river Sierra Leone, he captured at least 300 blacks, partly, as he said, by the sword and partly by other means. In 1564, Hawkins set out on a second voyage. The new expedition again made for the river Sierra Leone, and every day went on shore, quote, to take the inhabitants, burning and spoiling their towns, end of quote. So we can see that this so-called trade began with European criminals inflicting murder, mayhem, and terror on defenseless towns and villages along the west coast of Africa. And from those beginnings, they went on to create a whole industrialized system of enslaving, capturing and enslaving African people and bringing them across the Atlantic. That was the beginning. And from those beginnings, that system quickly mushroomed. It grew. And to get a sense of its growth and its importance, perhaps we could look at our own island of Barbados. Last year I produced this booklet. It's called What to the Republic of Barbados Does the 14th of May, 1625 mean? 1625, 14th of May, was the date on which the British first landed in Barbados and started this whole colonial enterprise. But in that book, I make the point that that British expedition that arrived, the one that arrived in 1627 to start the settlement, arrived with 10 enslaved Africans. That was the beginning of slavery in Barbados. Having begun with a mere 10 enslaved Africans in 1627, by the mid-1640s, at the outset of sugar production in Barbados, the island housed some 5,600 of our enslaved African ancestors. By 1860, that number had risen to 38,000, and with an average of 1,300 arrivals a year, it reached 54,000 by the year 1700. So there was a rapid expansion, particularly when we went into sugar production. Perhaps the most famous and moving account of the arrival of our enslaved African ancestors in Barbados is the testimony that the ex-slaved turned abolitionist Oloda Equiano published in his book entitled The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Oloda Equiano. And he is very important. He was captured in the territory of what is now Nigeria, brought across the Atlantic in a slave ship to Bridgetown, Barbados. At last, we came in sight of the island of Barbados, and we soon anchored at Bridgetown. We were conducted immediately to the merchant's yard, where we were pent up all together like so many sheep in a fold. We were sold after their usual manner. On a signal given as the beat of a drum, the buyers rush at once into the yard where the slaves are confined and make a choice of that parcel they like best. In this manner, without scruple, our relations and friends separated, most of them never to see each other again. Oloda Equiano ultimately got his freedom, converted to Methodism, and published this very famous narrative, one of the famous anti-slavery narratives from a black abolitionist. In fact, you will learn that the very last book that John Wesley read on his deathbed in 1791 was Oloda Equiano's book, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Oloda Equiano. And so, yes, so they came to Barbados, it exploded. And how were they treated in Barbados? Well, we have some testimony from those centuries. The French missionary, Father Labat, Pierre Labat, writing about Barbados in the 17th century, and this is what he said, I quote, "The English do not look after their slaves well. The overseers get every ounce of work out of them, beat them without mercy for the least fault, and appear to care less for the life of a Negro than for a horse. The Negroes are regarded more like the beasts to whom all license is permitted, end of quote. He further noted that if the enslaved African tried to resist, the planters' savagery knew no bounds, and I quote, "The slaves who are captured are sent to prison and condemned to be passed through a cane mill, or be burnt alive, or be put into iron cages that prevent any movement, and in which they are hung up to branches of trees and left to die of hunger and despair," end of quote. And finally, how did Britain and Europe profit from all of this human misery? Well, the British historian Tristram Hunt records in 10 cities that made an empire, and I quote, "Profits from the slave trade fertilized the entire production system of Great Britain. The Welsh slate industry, Manchester textile production, Glaswegian, Bristol, and Liverpool banking, shipbuilding, and heavy engineering were all endowed by foreign funds drawn from the plantation system. It was the capital accumulation from the West Indies trade that financed James Watts and the steam engine, that is Britain's Industrial Revolution. The Atlantic trade was the dynamo for British industrial development. It was not only investment in new technologies, but also vital infrastructure of ports, new docks, most notably in London and Liverpool, canals, harbors, and agricultural improvements, which were made possible by the colonial tribute pouring in from the West Indies. You understand now why we say they owe us? Yes. Now, having set that background, let us introduce the man himself, John Wesley. And I'll move swiftly through this because you are Methodists. You probably know this better than me. John Wesley was born in England on 28th June 1703, 141 years after the commencement of the British slave trade. Born into a Church of England family, his father was a rector. He entered Oxford University in 1720, graduated in 1724, but remained to study for a master's degree, which he completed in 1727. He was ordained an Anglican priest in 1728 at the age of 25 years. In 1729, he returned to Oxford as a fellow, led an evangelical group on campus that was designated the Holy Club, also called Methodist, by fellow students and faculty. He served as a priest in the state of Georgia in what became the USA in 1736, where he came into direct contact with slavery. He returned to England, and as you know so well, in 1738, experienced his evangelical conversion through a warming of the heart experience at a Moravian meeting at Aldersgate Street in London. He was 34. By the next year, Wesley broke with the Moravians in London, believing that they had fallen into heresy. And it was at this stage that the Anglican John Wesley effectively began not the Methodist Church, but the Methodist Society in England. The church was to evolve gradually. In 1739, Wesley began to approve local or lay preachers. He evaluated and approved men who were not ordained by the Anglican Church to preach and do pastoral work. And so the number of his societies expanded, the need for houses to worship in increased. Wesley began to establish chapels, first in Bristol, then in London. And after 1739, Wesley organizes what ultimately became the Methodist Church. He created and put in place the Methodist class meeting system, quarterly visitations of societies, circuits, quarterly meetings, annual conferences, the general rules for the United Societies. He ordained ministers. He expanded into Ireland. And that takes us to the year 1774. Wesley is now 71 years of age. Methodism is well established. And Wesley, at the age of 71, has gone from being regarded as a radical to being one of the most respected and loved men in England. It is at this stage that Wesley writes and publishes this 30-page book titled Thoughts upon Slavery. Now, by 1774, this issue of slavery had become the major issue of philosophical, religious, and political disputation within English society. This was at the time when that West Indian, that slave trade and plantation system was at the height of its prosperity. Prominent men and women, and some women, were beginning to take up positions on either side of the issue, some for, some against. But there had not yet emerged any significant organized abolition movement in England. Yes, you had the example of the Quakers who had expressed some anti-slavery views. You had the activism of Granville Sharp, who had gotten involved in a couple cases on behalf of enslaved blacks in England. But Wilberforce had not yet come on the scene. The Abolition Society had not even been thought of yet. And although some scholars had written on the topic, the truth is that most of them had written in support of the slavery system. Works by men like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, David Hume, Benjamin Franklin, Edward Long, in support of the slavery system. So it is against that background that, like a bolt of lightning, this book is published in 1774. It is published almost simultaneously in England and in Philadelphia. It is a book that is aimed at a mass audience. In other words, Wesley was not publishing some scholarly treatise for scholars. It was aimed at a mass audience. And I have to tell you, it was a bestseller. It went through 4 editions in the first 2 years. It was read by thousands and thousands of people. And in that book, and you can find copies of it online, there ended up being 5 editions. But I'm going to quote from the very first edition. In that book, Wesley basically posed and answered 7 questions. So these were the questions that were hot topics of debate about this slavery issue. The first question that he posed and answered was, what kind of country are the Africans brought from? First question. And this is what Wesley said. And I quote him, concerning the Senegal coast, the farther you go from the sea, the more fruitful and well improved is the country, abounding in pulse, Indian corn, and various fruits. Here are vast meadows which feed large herds of great and small cattle, and the villages which lie thick show the country is well peopled. Bear in mind, Wesley had done an enormous amount of research and had read the accounts of eyewitnesses, travelers who had gone into Africa and had come back with their tales. The Gold Coast and Slave Coast, all who have seen it agree, is exceedingly fruitful and pleasant. The very same account is given of the soil and produce of the kingdoms of Benin, Congo, and Angola, from all which it appears Guinea in general is far from the horrid, dreary, barren country, but is one of the most, because that is how it was being depicted by the detractors, that this was a terrible place, that these Africans would have been happy to be removed from this terrible place. He said, far from being a horrid, dreary, barren country, it is one of the most fruitful as well as the most pleasant countries in the known world. It is said indeed to be unhealthy, and so it is to strangers, but perfectly healthy to the native inhabitants. That's the first question. Second question, what type or quality of people are the Africans? And this is how Wesley answered that question. He said, the Senegal country is inhabited by three nations, the Jalos, Fulis, and Mandingos. The people are of quiet and good disposition, and so well instructed in what is right that a man who wrongs another is the abomination of all. They desire no more land than they use, which they cultivate with great care and industry. They support all that are old or blind or lame among themselves. These three nations practice several trades. They have smiths, that's blacksmiths, saddlers, potters, and weavers. The inhabitants of the grain and ivory coast are seldom troubled with war. If a difference happens between two nations, they commonly end the dispute amicably. All the natives of this coast, though heathens, believe that there is one God, the author of them and all things. Every town and village has a place of public worship. It is remarkable that they have no beggars among them. Such is the care of the chief men in every city and village to provide some easy labor even for the old and weak. Upon the whole, therefore, the Negroes who inhabit the coast of Africa, from the river Senegal to the southern bounds of Angola, are so far from being the stupid, senseless, brutish, lazy barbarians, the perfidious savages they have been described. On the contrary, they are represented by them who have no motive to flatter them as remarkably sensible, and are far more mild, friendly, and kind to strangers than any of our forefathers were. End of quote. Third question, how do the Europeans procure slaves in Africa? And Wesley answers. He says, part of them by fraud. Captains of ships from time to time have invited Negroes to come on board and then carried them away. But far more have been procured by force. The Christians landing upon their coasts seized as many as they found, men, women, and children, and transported them to America. It was some time before the Europeans found a more compendious way of procuring African slaves by prevailing upon them to make war upon each other and to sell their prisoners. Until then, they seldom had any wars, but were in general quiet and peaceable. But the white men first taught them drunkenness and avarice, and then hired them to sell one another. That their parents sell their own children is utterly false. Whites, not blacks, are without natural affection. Imagine that. Wesley said this slander that they have perpetrated, that these people sell their children, he said that is not true. He said it is whites, not blacks, who are without natural affection. Question number 4. How are the enslaved Africans transported to the Americas? And he answers, England supplies her American colonies with Negro slaves, amounting, and bear in mind, I'm not reading the whole text, right? I have extracted from each segment the core of Wesley's argument, his contention. So I'm giving you the core answer to each of the questions. England supplies her American colonies with Negro slaves, amounting in number to about 100,000 every year. So many are taken aboard our ships, but at least 10,000 of them die in voyage. About a fourth part more die at the different islands in what is called the seasoning. When they are brought down to the shore in order to be sold, our surgeons thoroughly examine them, and that quite naked, women and men without any distinction. Those that are approved are set on one side. In the meantime, a burning iron with the arms or name of the company lies in the fire with which they are marked on the breast. Before they are put into the ships, their masters strip them of all they have on their backs, so that they come on board stark naked, women as well as men. It is common for several hundred of them to be put on board one vessel, where they are stored together in as little room as it is possible for them to be crowded. Question number 5. What conditions of life are the enslaved Africans subject to in the Americas? And he said, banished from their country, from their friends and relations forever, from every comfort of life, they are reduced to a state scarce any way preferable to that of beasts of burden. A few roots are their food, and 2 rags. Their sleep is very short, their labor continual, and frequently above their strength, so that death sets many of them at liberty before they have lived out half their days. Did the Creator intend that the noblest creatures in the visible world should live such as this? As to the punishment inflicted on them, Sir Hans Sloane says they frequently gel them, that is, chop off half the foot. After they are whipped till they are raw all over, some put pepper and fat upon them, some drop melted wax upon their skin, others cut off their ears and constrain them to boil and eat them. In order to rivet the chains of slavery, the law of Virginia ordains that no slave shall be set free upon any pretense whatever, except for some meritorious services. But the law of Barbados exceeds even this. And it goes on to deal with Barbados. But I'm not going to get into that. It would take too long. One gentleman, when I was abroad, thought fit to roast his slave alive. And then he comes to the heart of what is the contention in Europe. The sixth question: is slavery consonant with the fundamental principles of justice? Is slavery legal? And this is how Wesley deals with that. He says, the grand plea is, quote, it is authorized by law. In other words, that is what the defenders of slavery say. It is authorized by law. And Wesley answers, but can law, human law, change the nature of things? Can it turn darkness into light or evil into good? By no means. Notwithstanding 10,000 laws, right is right and wrong is wrong still. There must still remain an essential difference between justice and injustice, so that I still ask, who can reconcile this treatment of the Negroes first and last with justice? Where is the justice of inflicting the severest evils on those that have done us no wrong, of depriving those that never injured us in word or deed of every comfort in life, depriving them of liberty itself, to which an Angolan has the same natural right as an Englishman? I absolutely deny all slaveholding to be consistent with any degree of natural justice. I cannot place this in a clearer light than that great ornament of his profession, Judge Blackstone, has already done. Part of his words are as follows, and he goes into Judge Blackstone. The three origins of the right of slavery assigned by Justinian are all built upon false foundations. Slavery is said to arise from captivity in war, the conqueror having a right to the life of his captive, but this is untrue. The law of nations, this is untrue if they imply that the law of nations is that a man has a right to kill his enemy. He has only a right to kill him in particular cases, in cases of absolute necessity for self-defense. War itself is justifiable only on principles of self-preservation. Therefore, it gives us no right over prisoners except to hinder their hurting us by confining them. Much less can it give a right to torture or kill or even enslave an enemy when the war is over. Then he goes into one man can sell himself to another man, and the Justice Judge Blackstone says this is incorrect. Every sale implies an equivalent given to the seller in lieu of what he transfers to the buyer. But what equivalent can be given for life or liberty? Nonsense. And then he goes on, we are told that men may be born slaves by being the children of slaves, and he dismisses that as well. He says, it clearly follows that all slavery is as irreconcilable to justice as to mercy. And then the final question, is slavery economically necessary and indispensable? I answer, I deny that villainy is ever necessary. It is impossible that it should be necessary for any reasonable creature to violate all the laws of justice and mercy and truth. No circumstances can make it necessary for a man to burst in sunder all the ties of humanity. It can never be necessary for a rational being to sink himself below a brute. But it may be answered, and this is what they say. The whole method now used by the original purchasers of Negroes is necessary to the furnishing our colonies yearly with 100,000 slaves. Wesley says, I grant this is necessary to that end. But how is that end necessary? Why? You say it is necessary to your gaining 100,000 pounds? I deny that your gaining 1,000 pounds is necessary, either to your present or eternal happiness. And then they answer Wesley, they say, but you must allow these slaves are necessary for the cultivation of our lands, inasmuch as white men are not able to labor in hot climates. I answer, it were better that all those islands should remain uncultivated forever. Yea, it were more desirable that they were altogether sunk in the depth of the sea than that they should be cultivated at so high a price as the violation of justice, mercy, and truth. They answer Wesley, they say, but the furnishing us with slaves is necessary for the trade and wealth and glory of our nation. And Wesley answered, here are several mistakes. For wealth is not necessary to the glory of any nation, but wisdom, virtue, justice, mercy, generosity, public spirit, love of our country. These are necessary to the real glory of a nation, but abundance of wealth is not. And having posed and answered those questions, Wesley then directs a word of admonition and advice to several groups of people. The first group he singles out is the captains of slave ships. And he tells them, to the captains employed in this trade, most of you know the country of Guinea. You well know how populous, how fruitful, how pleasant it was a few years ago. You know the people were not stupid, not wanting of sense. Neither did you find them savage, fierce, cruel, treacherous, or unkind to strangers. On the contrary, they were in most parts a sensible and ingenious people. They were kind and friendly, courteous and obliging, and remarkably fair and just in their dealings. Such are the men whom you hire, your own countrymen, to tear away from this lovely country, part by stealth, part by force, part made captive in those wars which you rise or foment on purpose. You have forced them into your ships like a herd of swine, them who have souls immortal as your own. May I speak plainly to you? I must. Love constrains me. Love to you as well as to those you are concerned with. Is there a God? You know there is. Is he a just God? Then there must be a state of retribution, a state wherein the just God will reward every man according to his works. Then what reward will he render to you? Oh, think betimes before you drop into eternity. Think now. He shall have judgment without mercy that had showed no mercy. Then will the great God deal with you as you have dealt with them, and require all their blood at your hands. And at that day it shall be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah than for you. He then turned his attention to the merchants, and he said to the merchants, it is you that induced the African villain to sell his countrymen, and in order thereto to steal, rob, murder men, women, and children without number, by enabling the English villain to pay him for so doing. It is your money that is the spring of all that empowers him to go on, so that whatever he or the African does in this matter is all your act and deed. And is your conscience quite reconciled to this? Does it never reproach you at all? Have no more any part in this detestable business. Instantly leave it to those unfeeling wretches who laugh at human nature and compassion. Be you a man, not a wolf, a devourer of the human species? Be merciful that you may obtain mercy. And then finally, he spoke a word to the plantation and slave owners. And this is what he said. And this equally concerns every gentleman that has an estate in our American plantations. Yea, all slave holders of whatever rank and degree, you are guilty, and principally guilty of all these frauds, robberies, and murders. You are the spring that puts all the rest in motion. They would not stir a step without you. Therefore, the blood of all these wretches who die before their time, whether in their country or elsewhere, lies upon your head. The blood of thy brother, for whether thou wilt believe it or not, such he is in the sight of him that made him. The blood of thy brother crieth against thee from the earth, from the ship, and from the waters. Oh, whatever it costs, put a stop to its cry before it is too late. Instantly, at any price, were it the half of your goods, deliver thyself from blood guiltiness. Thy hands, thy bed, thy furniture, thy house, thy lands at present stained with blood. Perhaps you will say, I do not buy any Negroes. I only use those left me by my father. It cannot be. Neither war nor contract can give any man such a property in another as he has in his sheep or oxen. Much less is it possible that a child of man should ever be born a slave. Liberty is the right of every human creature as soon as he breathes the vital air, and no human law can deprive him of that right which he derives from the law of nature. And then, as you would expect with a reverent, he ends with a prayer to God. And this is what he says. O thou God of love, thou who art the Father of the spirits of all flesh, thou who hast mingled of one blood all nations upon the earth, have compassion upon these outcasts of men who are trodden down as dung upon the earth. Arise and help these that have no helper, whose blood is spilt upon the ground like water. Are not these also the work of thine own hands, the purchase of thy son's blood? Stir them up to cry unto thee in the land of their captivity, and let their complaint come up before thee. Let it enter thy ears. Savior of all, make them free. Powerful. Powerful. That was what John Wesley published in 1774. Hilary Beckles could not have said it better. You cannot find a more compelling argument for reparations. You cannot find a more compelling appeal to the conscience of the people of Britain, of the Prime Minister, of the cabinet, of the king, of the churches, of the students, the women. That book, that bestseller, 4 editions in 2 years, read by thousands. 2 years after he published that book, Wesley organized a campaign to persuade all Methodists in America to cease owning slaves. That publication by Wesley then opened the floodgates of anti-slavery publications. So he was followed by Thomas Clarkson, who published his essay on the slavery and commerce of the human species, particularly the African, and several others. In 1776, Wesley's lieutenant, his right-hand man, he sent his lieutenant, Dr. Thomas Coke, he sent him out to the British West Indies for the first time. And Coke arrived with his well-established anti-slavery convictions. In 1787, 12 men, 10 Quakers plus Thomas Clarkson and Granville Sharp, founded the Committee and later the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. So Wesley makes that case in 1774. Takes up that issue seriously from 1774. The Society for the Abolition of Slavery is established in 1787. You see how far ahead of his time Wesley was. 1787. 1788, the British Privy Council appoints a committee to investigate the slave trade. In that same year, 1788, John Newton he too publishes a book, and it is called Thoughts Upon the African Slave Trade, using the same formulation as Wesley. And in 1789, Wilberforce makes his first anti-slave trade speech in Parliament. Again, Wesley is long before Wilberforce. 1789, the same year that Wilberforce speaks in Parliament for the very first time, Olaudah Equiano, who we heard about, the African who came across to Barbados and witnessed that auction block in Bridgetown, he converts to Methodism. By then he is free. He's become a free man, and he publishes the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, one of the most powerful anti-slavery texts. 1790, the Clapham sect is established. That is basically the kind of club that Wilberforce and these other Anglican evangelicals in Clapham, the community of Clapham, established. In 1788, Wesley, at the age of 85, held an anti-slavery event at the New Room in Bristol, where he preached against the slave trade, and his preaching virtually caused a riot, because Bristol was one of the centers of the slave trade. Wesley went into the lion's den and preached against the trade. It all caused a riot. He's 85 years old. But by 1791, Wesley has come to the end of his life. He's 88 years old. As you heard from the Reverend, the very last letter that he wrote was to William Wilberforce, encouraging Wilberforce to continue the struggle on his deathbed. And the very last book he read on his deathbed before he closed his eyes was Olaudah Equiano's anti-slavery narrative. Wesley died in 1791. A year later, 1792, the 5th edition of Thoughts Upon Slavery was published. So, John Wesley had staked out a very strong anti-slavery position for the Methodist Church. Very strong. You heard him. Eventually, the British slave trade is abolished in 1807. The Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, after the act is passed, they basically fade away and they transform themselves into something called the African Institution. And the African Institution, Wilberforce and the rest of them, they set this up to make sure the Slavery Abolition Act is properly implemented and that the abolition of slave trade, is extended to other countries. 1816 is the Buster Rebellion in Barbados. 1818 is very important for Methodists. This is the year of the establishment of the Wesleyan Methodist Missionary Society in England. That is the society that is now taking responsibility for sending out Methodist missionaries to places like the West Indies, places like Barbados. And this is just one of almost all the churches in England have established missionary arms. So the first one was the Anglican Church. Way back in 1701, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. Then you had the Baptist Society, the London Missionary Society, the Church Missionary Society, the British and Foreign Bible Society. Actually, the one who comes to the party last is the Methodists with the founding of the Wesleyan Methodist Missionary Society. Of course, missionaries had already been coming out since the 1780s, but on a kind of ad hoc basis. Now, in 1818, they put that institution in place. And from 1818, there's now a renewed Methodist missionary effort in the British West Indies, including Barbados. So you have Reverend Moses Rayner coming out in 1818, and he revives the church. The church had been floundering. Rayner comes out, sent out by the Missionary Society, and he does his work between 1818 and 1820. He gives way to Reverend William Shrewsbury in 1820. Now, what is the record of the Methodist anti-slavery record in the Caribbean? Well, the Wesleyan Methodist Missionary Society issued the following instruction to all Methodist missionaries in the West Indies before they went out. This was the instruction they gave them. You are in no case to visit the slaves of any plantation without permission of the owner or manager, nor are the times which you appoint for religious services to interfere with their owner's employ, nor are you to suffer any protracted meetings in the evenings, not even at Negro burials. In all these cases, you are to meet even unreasonable prejudices and attempt to disarm suspicions, however groundless, so far as you can do it consistently with your duties as faithful and laborious ministers of the gospel. So from that instruction, it tells you that the missionaries who were sent out were very tentative about running afoul of the plantocracy and the powers, the plantocratic powers that be in the West Indies. And this was not unique to the Methodists, all of the missionaries. All of the missionaries came with that kind of mindset. In a sense, very tentative, very much afraid to offend the slave masters, the authorities. The Methodists, and in fact all the churches of whatever denominations, kept themselves out of trouble as far as possible by concentrating not on the theoretical problems raised by the slavery system. That was left to the theologians in the home country, but on the morals of the slaves. And the great test for the missionaries came in the year 1823, the same year that brought the test to Sarah Ann Gill as well. In 1823 was a year in which the British government commenced upon a process called amelioration, where they took measures to supposedly lessen the evils of the slavery system, to ameliorate the terrible conditions that the enslaved were living under. And this caused great bitterness in the local slave-owning forces. And then in August of 1823, a slave rebellion broke out in Demerara. And the Times newspaper in London published the news about this slave rebellion. And the story that they initially put out said that there were 2 Methodist preachers who were at the heart of encouraging these slaves to rebel. That was the news that went out. Immediately, the Methodist Society in England inserted an advertisement in the press in the form of an open letter from its secretaries. They quoted from their instructions to their men going out to the West Indies, and this is what they printed. This is what they said they were telling their missionaries. Quote, "Your only business is to promote the moral and religious improvement of the slaves to whom you may have access, without in the least degree, in public or private, interfering with their civil condition." Ultimately, it was revealed that the quote-unquote offending missionaries in Demerara were not Methodists at all. In fact, it was actually a missionary from the London Missionary Society, a Reverend John Smith. And, you know, the slave-owning forces in Demerara really set up the man. The man hadn't really conspired with the slaves to create any rebellion, but the missionaries were always under suspicion. And especially the Methodists were always under suspicion. This is the enigmatic thing. The slave-holding classes in the Caribbean had a certain impression of the Methodists, probably stemming from John Wesley's strong anti-slavery concepts and activism. So the Methodists were viewed as abolitionists. The Methodists were viewed as active agents, people who were connected with the African institution, people who were connected with the abolitionists, and who were therefore very suspect. Why are they coming here? They're coming here to cause dissension and to cause the slaves to rebel. At the same time, the Missionary Society was telling the men, you are to do the opposite. You are to be careful. You are to deal with the morals of the slaves, religious instruction. You are not to get into political matters. Very different from the views of John Wesley. Eventually, the Wesleyan missionaries met in Kingston, Jamaica in September of 1824 to bring to an end once and for all of the insinuations being made against them in the colonies since the Demerara Rebellion. The meeting, all of these missionaries came together in Jamaica. The meeting examined all the allegations against them. One, that they believed slavery to be incompatible with Christian religion. So this is what the slaveholders were saying. The slaveholders were charging them, these Methodists, they believe slavery to be incompatible with Christian religion. Secondly, that their doctrines were calculated to produce insubordination among the slaves. Thirdly, that they were secretly attempting to put into operation means to effect the emancipation of the slaves. And fourth, that they were connected to and in secret correspondence with the African institution. The missionaries denied all of these charges emphatically and declared, and I quote, this is what they wrote, their belief that Christianity did not interfere with the civil condition of slaves, and that if the ideas of the emancipationists were carried into effect, it would be a general calamity, injurious to the slaves, unjust to the proprietors, ruinous to the colonies, deleterious to Christianity, and tending to the effusion of blood, end of quote. Very, very at odds with the Wesley message. But let us be absolutely fair to these missionaries and give the full picture of what they were facing. I'll give you one example. In 1831, there occurred another major slave rebellion, this time in Jamaica, led by a Baptist convert by the name of Samuel Sharp. And once again, the white colonists blamed the missionaries. A Jamaican newspaper named the Jamaica Courant raged, and I quote, this is what they wrote: "Shooting is too honorable a death for men whose conduct has occasioned so much bloodshed and the loss of so much prosperity. There are many fine hanging woods in St. James and Trelawney, and we do sincerely hope that the bodies of all the Methodist preachers who may be convicted of sedition may diversify the scene." You understand? You understand what the men were up against, right? So I just want to be fair to them, right? However, rather than executing them, the white authorities in Jamaica limited their revenge to expelling some of the missionaries in as humiliating a manner as possible. Another Methodist in Jamaica, though not a missionary, a man called Henry Whiteley, was also forced to leave Jamaica. He said, he wrote a book when he got back to England, he said in Jamaica he had witnessed the ruins of a Methodist chapel which had been destroyed by whites. Apparently, Whiteley had shown an interest in the slaves, and this aroused suspicion. The whites searched his belongings and found a letter he had written to a Methodist missionary. That was enough for them. They said that unless he left immediately, he would be tarred and feathered. He did not wait to find out. So that's what they were up against, right? But even after acknowledging the real dangers that the Methodists and other missionaries did face, We cannot be impressed with their appeasement of the slave master class and their lack of firm commitment to the human rights and freedom of the enslaved blacks. They fell far short of the standard that John Wesley had set for the Methodist Church. But what about the record of Sarah Ann Gill, our own Sarah Ann Gill? What about her record? We have to go back to that fateful year of 1823. This is when the crisis occurred that showed the mettle of Sarah Ann Gill. By 1823, the Methodist Church in Barbados had 90 members. There were 15 whites, 50 free coloreds or blacks or free blacks, 25 enslaved people, and then there were 200 hearers. Hearers were, as you know, people who were not yet members but showing an interest, coming around. Hearers. In 1823, Sarah Ann Gill was a 43-year-old widow, a free-colored woman, the daughter of a white plantation owner. She was the owner of several domestic slaves. These were slaves that she inherited. She would have grown up on. Her father was a white plantation owner, obviously had sexual relations with an enslaved woman on the plantation, produced this daughter, who then lived somewhere on the plantation, and who would have grown up with enslaved people on the plantation. When this man died, he made a will in which he bequeathed to, he never admitted she was his daughter, but he makes a will, and in this will he singles out this particular free colored girl, the young lady now, she's about 18 years old, and he bequeaths to her, he gives her a number of the companions she would have grown up with on the plantation as her slaves. So that's how she became a slave owner. This was a bequest from her father. So these were people who then would live in the household with her, but they were her slaves. Then she married a free-colored man, and he died, and he too made a will in which he bequeathed additional slaves to his widow, Sarah Ann Gill. So she was an owner of slaves, not people that she had purchased. These were bequests to her from her plantation owner father and her husband. But these were kind of like members of the household, somebody who would do the cooking, somebody a seamstress, somebody who was sent out to do retail selling and that kind of thing. Anyhow, in 1823, Sarah Ann Gill is a new member of the Methodist Church. She has joined in 1820, and she has become a class leader. But in 1823, the combination of that British government amelioration policy and the bitterness and animosity it caused in the white slave-owning population in Barbados, along with the Demerara slave rebellion in August of that same year, provoked the white community of Barbados to a state of murderous rage. This led to, one, the creation of a white mob intent on death and destruction. These people believed that the Methodists were connected to the African institution and were anti-slavery advocates. So they created a mob. That mob began its work by storming the James Street Chapel during service, invading it and pelting a bottle containing a noxious substance, probably acid, at Reverend Shrewsbury. The next Sunday, they stormed the chapel a second time. This time, they entered with firearms, and several gunshots were fired in the church. They then threatened Shrewsbury with murder. Shrewsbury went to the governor to appeal for protection. The governor rebuffed him. In other words, the governmental authorities, the government, were sympathetic to the mob. The next thing was that they destroyed the chapel over a 2-day period, a Sunday and Monday. The mob descended on the James Street Chapel and tore it down. Shrewsbury and his wife fled from Barbados in fear for their lives, and Shrewsbury was burnt in effigy. You know, they made a figure of him and burnt him. In addition, shots were fired at the house of an Anglican defender of Methodism, and the mob publicly described Methodism as a germ that they were determined to eradicate with fire and sword. So, after those events, in October of 1823, it became clear that anyone who continued to adhere publicly to the cause of Methodism in Barbados would become a target of the mob. And worse yet, if they included enslaved blacks or Africans in their Methodist praxis. Worse yet, so Methodism is bad enough among whites, free coloreds, free blacks, but if you include enslaved people now, even worse. In spite of this, Sarah Ann Gill stepped forward, assumed leadership of the now leaderless Methodist flock, and began to use her Bridgetown residence as the place where the members of the church would gather and meet, holding class and prayer meetings, and including enslaved persons. She also assumed the administration of the church, inclusive of organizing its community outreach activities, such as visiting the sick and shut-ins. This provoked the following potentially deadly backlash against her. And I want people to understand what this woman actually had to go through. More than once, her house was surrounded by the mob, who threatened to pull it down. She was attacked and vilified in the local newspapers. And when the anniversary of the 19th of October destruction of the chapel came around in 1824, the mob publicly announced that they were going to celebrate the anniversary of the destruction of the chapel by razing to the ground Sarah Ann Gill's house. That led Sarah Ann Gill to go to the authorities, just like Shrewsbury, to ask for protection. On this occasion, the authorities did offer her some protection because they had gotten some criticism from the people in England in relation to refusing to help Shrewsbury. So on this occasion, the mob was not able to burn down her house, but they surrounded her house and burnt her in effigy. 2 magistrates then visited her house while a prayer meeting involving enslaved persons was taking place. And this is what they told her. They objected to the meetings as being contrary to law and told her that, and I quote, her private house should not have such an assembly of people as they had seen, especially as many were slaves, end of quote. She said, I asked one of these gentlemen whether he had not given me permission to hold the meeting. He said, yes, but I did not think that slaves attended. So you see the point I'm making. Methodism is bad enough, even for whites or free people, but to involve enslaved people takes it beyond the pale. The whole body of magistrates and constables then descended on her house, saying that they had come to search it for arms and ammunition. So all of them, the magistrates and the constables of Bridgetown, they all entered the woman's house, saying they come to search it for arms and ammunition, which they had been told that she was hiding in her house. And she told them, well, search, come search. Eventually they didn't search, but they forbade her to hold any more meetings. They also told her that they would bear no responsibility if she was fatally injured. And then, if that were not bad enough, the all-white House of Assembly then got into the do. They made representation to the governor against her and caused her to be summoned before the all-white Legislative and Privy Council, where she was interrogated about her activities. After the council interrogated her, they referred her case to a sitting of the magistrates in the town hall on a criminal charge of having breached the Conventicles Act of 1670. So that was an old act that said that no one was entitled to hold a religious meeting that involved more than 5 people, except it was a meeting of the Church of England. Any religious meeting of more than 5 people that was not adhering to the doctrine of the Church of England was a crime to be prosecuted. And that act was still in place. So she went before the magistrates. She underwent what the lawyers would call a preliminary inquiry. Witnesses were brought to testify against her. And at the end of that trial, the magistrates committed her to stand trial at the Grand Court of Sessions, what we would call the assizes. And they forbid her once again from using her house to hold services pending her trial. While all of this was going on, Reverend Rayner and other missionaries, Rayner was in St. Vincent, and other missionaries assigned to Barbados by the Wesleyan Missionary Society refrained from entering Barbados because of threats to their life. This led Sarah Ann Gill to write to Reverend Rayner as follows. I want to listen to her words, because this tells you something about the woman, right? She says to him, I do not like to advise, but the Lord does, on peculiar occasions, use the weak to help the strong. I do not advise you to come, but I say, was it me, I would come. I would come. Meanwhile, she continued to hold class meetings, quote, as privately as possible without singing, end of quote. And no doubt with slaves attending. So I'm just, this is a woman of tremendous courage, facing all that she is facing. Even the missionaries afraid to come, she is standing alone, holding the whole thing together. Eventually, in June of 1825, on the urgings of the Wesleyan Methodist Missionary Society in England and such abolitionist parliamentarians as Thomas Fowell Buxton, the British House of Commons was finally motivated to take up the twin matters of the destruction of the chapel and the persecution of Sarah Ann Gill. They came up before the House of Commons, and on the 25th of June, 1825, the House of Commons passed a resolution condemning the destruction of the chapel, ordering that instructions be sent to the governor to prevent any reoccurrence of such an outrage, and instructing the government to, quote, take whatever measures were necessary for securing ample protection and religious toleration to all His Majesty's subjects in that part of His Majesty's dominions, end of quote. So that was the critical breakthrough. So the British government, by edict, laid down the law, religious toleration, no restriction in worship, whether for free people or enslaved people. So all of the West Indian colonies benefited from the persecution and activism of Sarah Ann Gill, because that was a law that now applied right across the British West Indies. So I'm just going to conclude now. What does all of this say about Sarah Ann Gill? The record that emerges is as follows. 1, she was a pioneer of nonviolent civil disobedience in Barbados. She did in Barbados what later people like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King did in their respective struggles. Secondly, she was an advocate of the equal humanity of blacks. Thirdly, she was an advocate of the entitlement of blacks to certain basic human rights, such as the right to religion, the right to worship. Fourth, she exhibited a willingness to defend the fundamental rights of blacks, even at the expense of her reputation, property, and life. And finally, we have to say that unlike the Methodist missionaries sent out from England, she did not compromise, appease, or run and hide. So I want to say that in the right excellent Sarah Ann Gill, the Methodist Church has a hero that towers above all of those missionaries who, rather than adhering to the example and policy of John Wesley, were so willing to appease and not to commit themselves in a serious way to the freedom of the enslaved people. So we have a heroine that, in my opinion, transcends all of them by her example. And I want to conclude by saying to the church, there are 3 things that I think the church needs to take from this entire story. The first thing is we need to use, well, I said the church, but this is for the whole reparations infrastructure. We need to use Wesley's book in our reparations campaign internationally and especially in the United Kingdom. We need to deploy this book as a weapon, as an instrument in our struggle for the hearts and minds of the English people. A few years ago, the BBC did a poll of the English people. They polled them to inquire who they considered to be the 100 greatest Britons in history, in the whole history of Britain. And John Wesley came in at number 50. So in terms of the whole, as they see their whole history, John Wesley for them is number 50 among the top 100 Britons. So the point I'm making is there has to be in the body politic of that country a residual respect for this man, and we must therefore use him and his words in our struggle. Secondly, there's a challenge to the Methodist Church in Barbados to fully, consciously, and willfully embrace and own the Wesley and Gill emancipatory traditions, to own them, to appropriate them, to own them, and to deploy them in this society. For example, that 19th of October date, the date of the destruction of the James Street Chapel, should be commemorated annually by the Methodist Church. And it should be a reminder to this country about that struggle for the humanity, the fundamental human rights of African people, of oppressed people. And then finally, for the Methodist Church in a developing, one of the criticisms that was historically leveled at the Methodist Church was that, the Methodist Church was the pioneer of evangelism. In the 18th century, British Christianity had become very formulaic, simply going through the motions, very establishment-oriented, the Church of England, etc. It lacked passion, and the Methodist Church was a rebellion against all of that. And the Methodist, the Methodist Church really became the church of the poor. But because the Methodists put such an emphasis on moral correctness and discipline, that's why they were called Methodists. They're very disciplined, so very passionate, an evangelical attitude towards the gospel and towards religion and evangelism, but within a construct of moral rectitude and discipline, etc. And so the Methodists came under some attack by critics who said, look, rather than their message to poor people, live upright lives, be disciplined, that seemed to not confront the poverty, but in a sense telling poor people, accept your poverty and be morally upright and disciplined and righteous and just, etc. And I can understand the conundrum that the church found itself in. But to me, the way to resolve it, especially in a developing ex-slave society like Barbados, is to articulate the social holiness theology of the content of that theology through a prism of a social democracy construct. So yes, Methodism does not put emphasis on personal prosperity and the prosperity gospel and all of that, but Methodism can and should and probably already does, but embrace the concept of the social democracy. So our emphasis is not simply on personal wealth, but it is on education for all, healthcare for all, housing for all, a caring, nurturing society that has that communal construct. I mean, that is really the heart of the Barbados story. That is the heart of our journey from the depths of what we experienced in the 1930s, black people in the 1950s finally getting their hands on the instruments of government and using those instruments to lift up the collective. Lift up the collective. So I am saying that the Methodist Church should be the foremost, advocates of that doctrine of social democracy, of not a society that is looking for individual aggrandizement and individual wealth, but social wealth, social capital, all of the communal and social programs that we know are necessary to nurture and lift up human beings. I say social democracy. Some people say democratic socialism. I mean, you choose your concept, but we know what we are talking about. We are not talking about individual extravagant living and individual wealth. We are talking about social capital and lifting up people in a collective way. I think that is one of the charges that comes out of this very compelling story. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You have been a very good audience.
Your Excellency, we invite you to stay there. We invite you to stay here so that you can field your questions. I shouldn't come too near to that. Gentlemen, it has been absolutely riveting in terms of the information that has been shared with us. So as an interim move, we will thank him again properly, but as an interim move, I would like you to put your hands together again to thank His Excellency. So we've heard a significant amount, but we've not only heard it, there are things that went straight to our chests and to our hearts. And one of the things that resonates with me is the importance of the constructive engagement. You have laid out so well the story that gives us this great heritage that we have, this backbone that is there even when we knew of the stories. You know, we have had plays and so on about Sarah Ann Gill. We have had various engagements with John Wesley, but I was actually hearing a full documentary as you were speaking, and I am saying that with all humility and honesty. So as we go forward, I'm not going to recap everything because, you know, you said it so well I couldn't. But we do invite the members of our audience to ask you questions before I use any chair's privileges and start to rattle off any, because you've given us so much to think about. You've told us about the rich history. You set up the context in which John Wesley lived and came up with his ideas on how people, human beings, should be treated, and how that is linked to basic humanity, and also to how we are as people of religion and people of faith. You have shown how he debunked every single argument that they could come with about how slavery could be justified and right and moral and so on. You've added the Sarah Ann Gill story in terms of her contribution. Again, more courage. And you have shown us that that's the thing we need to go forward. So our technical team have put a microphone in the middle of the room, and I know that persons will be lining up one after the other behind this microphone. No big ceremony and so on. Once you get to the microphone, you are next.
We don't have to ask questions. We can make comments.
Oh yes, thank you so much. And Mr. Comissiong has indicated it doesn't have to be questions, it can be comments. Thank you for assisting the chair. It can be comments. We welcome those, your impressions, your feelings, things that you thought about one way, but you've been given some more to think about, anything like that. We welcome them very much because it is not only teaching, but it is how does it hit you here? And do you feel we can move from this point? And how can we move from this point? I see number one and number two. Whoever gets to the microphone first. Others can line up behind you. Tell Brother Stephen, he won't be long.
I want to thank you for a very positive message. But before I go any little further, I want to remind you still have your collar on.
Oh.
I'd like you to, if you could, expand a little bit on the John Smith situation that arose in Guyana and how did that reflect the Sarah Ann Gill situation in Barbados.
Well, you know, as I said, the first piece of misinformation that came out was that it was Methodist missionaries who were involved. So that would have riled up the Barbadian population. John Smith was, as I said, of the London Missionary Society, probably a Congregationalist. He was put on trial in Guyana. Obviously, a white planter-dominated court. He was found guilty, and they sentenced him to death. And he was placed in jail, awaiting execution. But I guess because he was a British missionary, the word was sent back to England about this death sentence and whether it should be carried out or whether it should be commuted. And eventually, the monarch decided to commute the death sentence. But by the time the word of the commutation got back to Guyana, John Smith was on his deathbed. So, you know, he died very tragically. I can't remember if he died still in prison, or right after they let him out. But yes, because there was no real evidence that he had plotted or he had instigated the slave rebellion. But these whites were so suspicious. In fact, really and truly, the only missionaries that they were perhaps not suspicious of were the Church of England missionaries. And, you know, the conventional wisdom in the West Indian colonies were that they preferred, first of all, for much of the history, they were opposed to the enslaved people having any religious instruction at all. But if you had to have religious instruction, then they preferred that those given the religious instruction were Church of England personnel who they felt were more trustworthy, you know, and were not part of that abolitionist consciousness. So with the exception perhaps of the Anglican clergymen, all the other missionaries came under intense suspicion, and especially the Methodists. And as I said, I suspect especially the Methodists because of the well-known abolitionist sentiments, not just of John Wesley, but of Dr. Thomas Coke as well, who was the first missionary to come out to the... I remember he first came out, he undertook nine journeys to the West Indies, 9 missionary journeys, beginning in the 1780s when Wesley was still, you know, very much alive. So he would have established grounds for that particularly viewing of the Methodist missionaries from way back in the 1780s, that these were people abolitionist sentiments, you know. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question, but as I was saying, it was the combination of the news of that, and remember, you know, Barbados had experienced its own slave rebellion just a few years before, in 1816. And if you look at the dispatches of Lord Combermere, who was the governor in Barbados in that post-1816 period, they were writing back to the colonial office saying that the white community in Barbados is full of apprehension about when the next slave rebellion will break out. In fact, they describe them as almost sitting over a powder keg, not knowing when the powder keg will explode. So when during that year they got word of the British Parliament taking these amelioration measures, which they thoroughly objected to, and then the slave rebellion, that was it. That was it. They were now ready to form that mob and to, as they say, eradicate this germ by fire and by sword, you know. Yeah.
Yes, sir. I just want to say thanks for the enlightening lecture that you give. In your preamble, you mentioned that the three nations who voted against, 223 nations voted for.
123.
123, and 3 against.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I could understand the United Nations, United States, and Israel. But did Argentina receive slaves, and why? What reason did they vote against?
Well, I mean, historically, Argentina has been a very racist country, very hostile to black people. In fact, you will scarcely find, yes, Argentina did receive slaves. Yes, there was a time when Argentina had a sizable black population. But if you go to Argentina today, you will scarcely find any black people. And that is because in the late 19th century, Argentina had a deliberate policy of genocide against their black population. For example, when Argentina went to war, there was a famous war. Argentina would send the blacks to the front line to be slaughtered. So that's the history. But right now, Argentina is under a very reactionary president, a very reactionary government that is very close to Donald Trump and very similar in terms of their ideas and their policies. So it is no wonder that Argentina, the current government of Argentina, will slavishly follow wherever the U.S. wishes to lead them. Yeah, Liz?
Ambassador Thompson?
Ambassador Comissiong, thank you for a really interesting lecture. I do have 2 questions which I hope won't open up another lecture, because I understand that the hour is late. The first, and my questions really have to do more with reparations. So question 1 would be, how do you respond to the argument that people in the UK, US, etc. make that they concede there are historical wrongs, but it's really nothing to do with them, because they never enslave anybody. So how do you build a case for reparations in the context of that kind of hands-off denial, where there is concession of wrong, but says it's not connected to me? That's one. And second, what do you think a suite of reparations or a program of reparations would look like? Because that is another argument that people have a difficulty with. How do you calculate? What are the principles that you use to determine what reparations could look like?
Well, you know, attached to this argument, and that is the Richard Drax argument, oh, it was my ancestors who did it, nothing to do with me, even though I am the richest man in the British House of Commons, but my fortune had nothing to do with Sir James Drax. Anyhow, it is just nonsense. But they attach to that the argument that, oh yes, we admit we did all these terrible things, but we don't owe you reparations because at the time when we did them, slavery was illegal. All right, so those are the twin those arguments, and the British have been saying this foolishness about slavery being legal since the World Conference Against Racism in 2001. I actually addressed this issue of slavery being legal. First of all, it is bogus. I mean, you heard Wesley in his own way demolish it, but there's even a more profound legalistic argument for demolishing it, and I outline it in this booklet. Because the Barbados House of Assembly had a lot to do with that bogus notion that slavery was legal, right? Anyhow, but as you said, that's another lecture, and we can't really go into that here. But the point is, there's something called unjust enrichment. You know, the historians tell you how the wealth of Britain was built and the role that the triangular trade, Africa, Caribbean, back to Britain, the plantation economies, the role, the extraction, all the centuries of unpaid labor, the fact that the triangular trade was used as the dynamo to build British banking, insurance, shipbuilding, you name it. So no reasonable and rational person could believe that Britain carried out this slavery system for hundreds of years, siphoning off so much of this wealth, making people work, for nothing, generation after generation, siphoning off all of this wealth to British families and British companies, and that the wealth that they enjoy today has no connection with any of that, But fundamentally, the approach of CARICOM to the reparations thing is to say to these governments, look, this is the history. This is what you did. It was criminal. It was a crime against humanity. It caused a lot of damage. It caused a lot of injury, some of the effects of which are lasting up to today. By the same token, your country, your families, your institutions, your universities, your companies, your governments benefited. You were developed on the basis of this. And what we are saying to you is, come and sit with us. Admit that there's a wrong to be addressed. Come and sit with us and let us discuss what role you can play to help repair some of this damage. You're probably quite right, Liz, if we stick to the strict idea of reparations, where we calculate a money value and say this is the bill you have to pay, they probably could never pay that bill, right? But that has not been the CARICOM approach. The CARICOM approach has been to say we have to address the historical legacies of underdevelopment that are rooted in those centuries of enslavement and colonial exploitation. So we have a developmentalist approach. Come and sit with us and let us agree upon among ourselves what developmental measures we can put in place to address those legacies of underdevelopment. Yes, of course, there'll be a money element as well, but we are looking at a sophisticated negotiation of a package of reparation measures and programs that both sides say, well, we can live with this. We believe that this will do justice justice to the situation. But we haven't been able to bring the governments to that negotiating or discussion table yet. We have had universities admitting and apologizing and making efforts. We have had some companies doing similarly, admitting, apologizing. We have had families, several families, establishment families, the Gladstones, the Trevelyan's, for example. They formed something called, a group called the Heirs of Slavery. We have had the Church of England apologizing, admitting, yes, we were involved in the South Sea Company, the slave trading company, and that created a foundation for our massive investment fund of billions of pounds, you know. But up to now, even King Charles, when he was Prince Charles at the Commonwealth Heads of Government Conference, said, I have come to recognize, I've come to have a deeper understanding of this thing called slavery and the great damage that was done. And reparations is a conversation whose time has come. So even the man who is the monarch, but of course it's a constitutional monarchy, he can't give any instructions to the government. But none of the European governments basically have yet come to the table. So we have to carry on a campaign of activism and agitation. We have to use all of the strategies at our disposal. There's no one strategy that is going to win it for us. We have to deploy all of the strategies. And I'm saying that in addition to diplomatic, legal, political strategies, a very important strategy has to be to reach out, to touch the hearts and consciences of, as I said, you're not going to get all, but at least important sectors of that society. In fact, that was part of the story of the abolition of slavery. The abolition movement was able to reach out and touch the hearts and consciences of tens of thousands of British people. You know, so there's a precedent for it. And it just seems to me that this example of this religious leader, this almost foremost religious leader of Britain, who stands so tall and who produced such a compelling document, that we would be doing ourselves an injustice if we do not make Wesley and his book, you know, an integral part of our reparations campaign. Yeah? I hope that at least sheds some light.
We have one more question.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for a very enlightening discourse on John Wesley and the slavery narrative. My name is Reverend Buddy Laria. And if my understanding is correct, and I stand to be corrected, John Wesley was born after 1661, when Barbados, under British, declared that black people were chattel, not human beings. And as I look around, I can't see any white, what we would call white people. And John Wesley said, the white people thinks differently, using my own words, than black people. he also wrote the book and published it, bestsellers, in 1774. It did not have the impact that it should have, because in 1776, the United States of America put in their constitution, based on Barbados' 1661 slave code that said that black people were not human beings. They said that black people were only 3/5 human beings. And if we are correct that in February the 14th, Marco Rubio went to Munich this February, went to Munich and asked the European nations to support him in America on recolonizing the Caribbean. This is not what I suggest, this is what he said, basically. And if we are right that at the 25th March resolution in the UN, not a single European country supported the resolution. And as you would say, they either voted against it or acknowledge that they're against it, or they're not for it. And I am really concerned, and perhaps you could help me here because you're the ambassador and you have a lot of information. On May the 8th, at the museum, I learned for the first time that the European Union to Barbados and the Caribbean is here launching their 50-year anniversary of new relations with the Caribbean. I conclude by saying, if most of the Caribbean countries are still under colonial rule by the European Union, and if they are so adamant that they are not going to suggest that we be paid reparations, this is what puzzling me, what relationship that they are having with the Caribbean now for 50 years. And I close with this. The one aspect that you mentioned or failed to mention, that until we take legal action against or lawful action against Britain in the first place, as far as Barbados is concerned, but the European Union, we will not be able to achieve the reparative justice that we want. So I'm putting this to you as a lawyer. If their world is based on law, 1661 slave code, lawful, that we were therefore, that slavery was legal, and we don't challenge the legality of that statement, we are wasting time, according to John Wesley, trying to convince white people who think different than us. Thank you very much.
Let me address, No, I agree that we have to pursue legal strategies. For example, we could bring a case against the UK at the International Court of Justice. However, it can only be for an advisory opinion. So yes, because when the UK signed on to the ICJ, they included a reservation in the treaty that said that they will only accept the jurisdiction of the ICJ for matters after they accede to the court, that is after 1974, and in any event, not for issues pertaining to their relationships with their former colonies of the past. So we could go to the ICJ, we could get the court to pronounce, but the decision of the court would not have binding legal effect on the UK, but it would be an advisory opinion. It would say, well, this is what we think the position is, and so you still have to come back to some level of moral suasion. There are other things that we could do too in various UN treaty bodies, like the UN has the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Human Rights Council, but those are more like kind of legal guerrilla warfare, where you can go after them, you could embarrass them, and so forth. So that's the point I'm making. There's not one strategy that is going to win it for us. It is going to be a combination, and a big part of that combination is a battle for public opinion. We want to reach a stage where we so tell our story to the world that wherever these European statesmen go, anywhere in the world, the first thing people are asking them is, but what about the debt you owe to the black people? What about the reparations you owe to the black people? And there's a UK party called the Reform Party, right? They have recently issued some statements. In fact, they said that if they come to power, they will have a policy of refusing visas to the citizens of any country that is demanding reparations for them. And you know what they said? Why we have come to this? They said because these people are embarrassing us all over the world. That's what they said. Read their statement carefully. They said all these countries are embarrassing us in all kinds of international forums. So I take comfort from that statement. Yes, we intend to embarrass you. If you can be so morally bankrupt that you can stand up on the world stage and say that while you admit that you did all those bad things, but you don't owe reparations, because back then slavery was legal, and this book explains what Buddy says is right. This Barbados House of Assembly came with the most evil scheme to say that the legal system that applies in England, where to enslave a human being is a crime, to mutilate a human being is a crime, to do all these things against, but these people, these are not human beings. These Africans are these wild creatures, and therefore, the legal regime that we have in our mother country that applies to human beings cannot apply to these creatures. And because of that, we, the Barbados House of Assembly, we are at liberty to design a totally different legal and constitutional regime to inflict on these wild creatures. So when you hear these European states, people telling you that they don't owe reparations because slavery was legal, they are telling you indirectly, we agreed with that notion that back then Africans were not human beings. Because the concept of slavery being legal is based on that idea, that these were not human beings. And that is why we could concoct this terrible slavery legal framework and impose it on these creatures. So it is a morally bankrupt position, and they need to be exposed. That their moral bankruptcy needs to be exposed, and they need to be made ashamed. And that's what we are saying. Show some moral conscience. Show some moral conscience and come and sit with us and let us discuss how we can resolve this tragic history and bring some justice to bear. So I would, the reason, as I said, the reason I did this book, this booklet, not book, I would say booklet, about 50 pages, 48 pages. I did this last year because last year, 2024, was the 400th anniversary, 2025, was the 400th anniversary of the first British landing on Barbados in 1625. And I said, surely an anniversary as important as a 400th anniversary, we must use it as an opportunity to reflect on this history and to see, what lessons this history has taught us and what missions this history has bequeathed to us as a nation going forward. So, but I was somewhat disappointed that we really did not have that national discussion last year. But I haven't lost all hope, because the next anniversary, the next 400th anniversary is 1627. 1627 was the year, they came in 1625, they found the island, they landed at the Hole in Hole Town, they claimed the island for King James I, they carved a tree in Hole Town, said this island belongs to King James I of England, and then they went away. But no, they didn't. But they actually sailed down and they discovered Indian River and so forth. But then they sailed away and they came back 2 years later to actually start the settlement. So 1625 is the first landing. 1627 is so next year will be the 400th anniversary of the settlement. But I hope that we do get a chance to really discuss what is in this book. And anybody who is interested, I didn't publish this as a money-making thing. This was really a gift to the people of Barbados to help us to reflect on that 400-year history. So you can reach out to me. You can get copies. I'm at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You can give me a shout there. You can get copies of, or I can even send it to you electronically as well. You can get an electronic copy as well. Just let me know. But yes, so buddy, I agree. We have to apply the legal strategies as well, but it has to be a complex. We have to go forward in a very sophisticated and comprehensive manner and win this battle, because the law is on our side, the facts are on our side, justice, righteousness is on our side. And you can't have so many things going for you. If you stick with it, you pursue it, with discipline and determination and conviction, ultimately we will prevail. Over to you.
Thank you very much.